The last thing Sienna Sullivan expected to see when she walked past the ice rink in Central Park on a windy Tuesday afternoon was a man teaching a group of kids how to skate and laughing like he didn't have a care in the world. She paused, squinting through the wind as her scarf flapped against her cheek. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark hoodie and worn jeans, a beanie pulled low over his ears. He moved with the kind of ease that said he'd done this 1,000 times, gliding backward in smooth arcs as he guided a little girl through her wobbly steps. "Push with your right foot, now glide," he said, kneeling briefly to tie the untied skate of a boy who looked too small for the skates he was wearing. "Don't look down, look at me. You've got this." Sienna tilted her head, warmth blooming in her chest despite the cold. There was something magnetic about him, not just how he looked, but how he talked to the kids. Patient, calm, like this mattered to him. She almost kept walking, almost, but her feet moved instead, drawn toward the edge of the rink where a few parents were watching. She recognized one of the girls from her after-school art class. "Lily?" Sienna called, and the 7-year-old turned, her face lighting up. "Miss Sullivan, my skating teacher's funny." That was how she ended up on the bleachers, hands in her coat pockets, watching the mystery man as the lesson wrapped up. He handed out high fives, helped a kid to his feet after a fall, then skated to the side with easy grace. When his eyes lifted and locked on hers, Sienna felt something shift in her chest. He stepped off the ice, pulled off his beanie, and ran a hand through his dark hair as he walked toward her. "You're Lily's art teacher?" "Yeah. I'm Sienna. I teach at Oak Ridge Elementary," she said, trying not to stare at how ridiculously good-looking he was up close. His eyes were a sharp steel blue, and his jaw was dusted with stubble. "You're really good with them." "I better be," he said, flashing a quick grin. "I've been skating since I was 3. I'm Vaughn Whitmore." "Nice to meet you, Vaughn." She offered her hand, and something electric sparked when he shook it. "You come to the rink often, or just stalking me specifically?" he teased, and she laughed, the sound catching in her throat. "I was just walking by. Didn't expect to see a full-on skating class led by a guy who looks like he should be in a cologne ad." He raised a brow. "Is that your way of saying I smell good?" She grinned. "You're on thin ice, Vaughn." He groaned playfully. "Terrible pun. You're definitely a teacher." That was how it started. A few days later, she passed by again and saw him teaching another group. Then again the next week. And then she was going on purpose. They started talking more. Vaughn was always there early, setting up cones and helping the smaller kids lace their skates. He had this way of making everyone feel seen. Kids adored him. Parents trusted him. And Sienna. She kept finding excuses to stop by. "So what's your actual job?" she asked one afternoon as they sat on the low bench by the rink. "You're not really making your fortune teaching kids to skate in Central Park." He looked at her for a beat too long. "I do some consulting work. Small stuff. Nothing exciting." "Consulting?" she echoed, unimpressed. "You're dodging." "Maybe," he said with a half-smile. She didn't push. He was kind. Funny. Grounded. When she joked about how she could barely pay her rent and he offered to teach her how to skate in exchange for a painting, she laughed it off. Vaughn didn't act like a man with money. He wore the same beat-up sneakers every time. Drank terrible diner coffee. Carried a reusable water bottle with stickers peeling off it. And yet, there was something about him that didn't quite add up. The truth came crashing in a week later. She was helping Lily's mom hang artwork in the school hallway for the upcoming fundraiser when a teacher ran by, waving a glossy magazine. "Did you know Vaughn Whitmore is on the cover of Forbes?" she gasped. "He's some tech millionaire. Launched a startup when he was 21. Sold it for, like, 70 million. Sienna's stomach dropped. "Wait. What?" She grabbed the magazine, scanning the article. Vaughn Whitmore, 32, founder of Whitmore Systems, known for his innovative approach to small-scale AI applications. Since stepping down as CEO 3 years ago, he's been quietly investing in underfunded education programs across New York. Her heart pounded harder with each word. That didn't sound like the guy who drank burnt coffee and wiped kids' noses with his sleeve. That night, she didn't go to the rink. She needed air, distance. And yet, 2 days later, he showed up outside her classroom after the final bell. "Hey!" She looked up from her desk. "Vaughn, you disappeared on me." "I saw the magazine," she said quietly. He nodded, stepping inside. "I figured. So. Tech genius, millionaire, education philanthropist. And you didn't think to mention any of that." "I wanted to tell you," he said, walking closer. "But I liked that you didn't know. That you talked to me like I was just a guy teaching kids how to skate." "You are," she said, voice tight. "But you let me believe that was all you were." "I wasn't hiding it to lie. I've dated women who were obsessed with the money. Who only saw the company, the wealth, the name. With you, it's been real. You laugh at my terrible jokes. You called me out on wearing mismatched gloves. You didn't care about any of it." "I didn't know about any of it," she said. "That's different." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. "I was going to give you this." She took it. Inside were sketches, her sketches. From her art club. From the time she'd let the kids draw outside the classroom. She blinked at the pages, stunned. "You remembered these?" "I asked Lily if she had any of your drawings. She said you give the best feedback, that you made her believe she could be an artist. I wanted something that reminded me of you. Of how you see the world." She looked up, her throat tight. "Why?" "Because I've been falling for you, Sienna. And I didn't want it to be because of who I was on paper." She stared at him, heart pounding. "I'm still the same guy," he said softly. "I still drink bad coffee and forget to replace the laces on my skates. I just happen to have a few more zeros in my bank account than I let on." She laughed, a shaky sound. "A few. Okay, maybe more than a few." She shook her head. "You drive me insane. But you're not walking away." "No," she said, stepping toward him. "I don't think I could even if I tried." And when he pulled her into his arms, the kiss was soft, sure, and full of every emotion that had been simmering between them. Neither of them said anything after. They didn't need to. That moment said everything. The first snowfall of December dusted the city in white the next morning, softening the edges of buildings and covering rooftops like icing on a cake. Sienna stood by her apartment window watching the flakes drift under the glow of the streetlights. Her fingers curled around the chipped rim of her coffee mug, but she hadn't touched it in 10 minutes. She hadn't slept much. The kiss with Vaughn had replayed in her mind all night, not just because of how it felt, but because of everything it meant. She believed he was a regular guy with a kind heart and a quiet life. Now she couldn't stop thinking about the man who'd handed her a notebook full of her own art. A man who'd spent weeks on the ice teaching kids how to skate when he could have been anywhere else in the world. That afternoon, she found herself walking the same path through the park, the one that curved beside the lake and led to the now half-covered rink. A few early risers were already skating, bundled in scarves and hats. Vaughn was there, kneeling to adjust a blade on one of the benches, his breath visible in the cold. He looked up as she approached and stood slowly. "You came back." "I wasn't sure if I should," she said, stopping a few feet away. "You don't have to decide anything right now," he said. "But I meant what I said. Everything." She hesitated, glancing at the ice. "Why here? Why this? You could be living in Monaco or flying to Zurich for some conference. Instead, you're here teaching kids to skate like it's the only thing that matters." "It's the only thing that feels real," he said simply. "I spent almost a decade in offices without windows. I launched a company that made me rich, but I was miserable. After I sold it, I didn't know who I was without the job. So I came back to the city and started volunteering, teaching, funding programs that actually matter. I don't want to be remembered for algorithms. I want to be remembered by the kids who learned they could stand back up after falling." A long silence stretched between them, filled only by the scrape of blades on ice and the distant bark of a dog. "I didn't know you were that lost," she said softly. "I did a good job pretending I wasn't." She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos. I brought hot chocolate. Figured you might need something better than diner coffee. Is it bribe hot chocolate? Because I accept. She handed it to him and their fingers brushed. He held it in both hands, warming them. Lily asked me yesterday if I was your boyfriend, he said, glancing sideways at her. I told her I wasn't sure yet. Sienna laughed, the sound catching her off guard. She's 7. She's already more direct than most adults. Yeah. She didn't seem impressed with my answer. Called me a maybe man. Well, we can't have that. His eyes met hers. So what am I? She took a deep breath. Someone I'm trying to trust. Someone who surprised me. Someone I can't stop thinking about. That's more than I hoped for. They didn't define anything more than that, but when he offered her his hand and she stepped onto the ice with him, it felt like the beginning of something new. In the days that followed, things shifted. Vaughn started showing up outside her school just before dismissal. He'd lean against the fence, looking entirely out of place in the sea of parents with his expensive-looking coat and that quiet intensity that made every teacher glance twice. But he never said a word about his wealth. Never made a show of anything. He asked questions. Listened. He wanted to know what her hardest day had been as a teacher, what project her students loved the most, what she dreamed of doing if money wasn't a problem. Sienna told him everything except the last part. Because money had always been a problem. The art program at Oak Ridge was held together with duct tape and donated supplies. Her classroom had one working sink and a ceiling tile that leaked when it rained. The kids deserved more, but the school couldn't afford it. One evening, after a long day of cleaning out the closet behind her classroom, she arrived home and found a box on her doorstep. No note, no return address. Inside were 3 sets of brand new paintbrushes, professional grade, and a full set of oils, acrylics, and watercolors. Every color she'd ever dreamed of having for her students. She stared at the box for a long time, then called Vaughn. You didn't have to do this. I didn't, he said. They just showed up. Mysterious. You're impossible, but the good kind. She didn't know when exactly the shift happened, but suddenly they were more than just 2 people who met at a rink. They were sharing dinners, him cooking surprisingly well. They were walking through bookstores, comparing favorite authors. She invited him to her apartment once, and he spent more time looking at the kids' artwork on her fridge than anything else. But just as she started to let herself fall, something shifted again. It started with a phone call during one of their late-night walks. Vaughn looked at the screen and didn't answer. The next night, it happened again. Everything okay? She asked. Just someone I used to work with, he said. They want me back in. She stopped walking. Back in. They offered me a board position for a firm in London. The short term. 6 months. She swallowed hard. Are you going to take it? I don't know. You didn't say no. I didn't say yes either. The silence between them was different now, thicker, heavier. Later that week, she overheard 2 parents at the rink talking about the Whitmore Fund and how generous he'd been. How he'd saved their after-school program with 1 donation. She confronted him that night. You're funding half the programs in this park, aren't you? He paused. Yes. And you didn't think to tell me? I didn't want you to feel like I was throwing money at things to impress you. It's not about impressing me, Vaughn. It's about being honest. I was trying to do something good. You were trying to control everything so I wouldn't see the full picture. I didn't want to lose you. You can't lose something you don't have. He didn't chase her when she walked away. For 3 days, she didn't hear from him. Then the envelope came, dropped off at the school office, hand-delivered. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was a donation confirmation, a full renovation for the Oak Ridge Art Department, signed anonymously. But she recognized the handwriting in the margin. For the kids who deserve color in their world. She folded the paper and clutched it to her chest. Her heart ached not from betrayal, but from the overwhelming realization that someone had seen what mattered to her and done something about it. But that wasn't what made her leave her classroom in a rush. It was the second slip of paper tucked behind the first. His boarding pass. Flight to London. Departing that night. She ran. She didn't think, didn't stop. She flagged a cab and begged the driver to go faster through the snow-slick streets. Her stomach twisted with every red light. She didn't know what she was going to say. She just knew she couldn't let him leave without knowing. That he mattered. That she forgave him. That maybe, just maybe, she was falling too. When she reached the terminal, she didn't see him at first. Her boots slid slightly on the polished floor as she rushed past the rows of gates, scanning every face. The overhead voice called final boarding for his flight. She turned the corner and saw him. He was standing by the window, staring at the runway, a duffel bag at his feet. Alone. Vaughn, she called out. He turned. His eyes widened. I got your note, she said, breathless. And the brushes. And the paint. And the classroom that's going to look like something out of a dream. I didn't do it for recognition. I know. That's why it means everything. He stepped closer. I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye. You shouldn't be leaving at all. He hesitated. I thought I had to. You don't. Or maybe you do. But what we have, it doesn't go away because you get on a plane. He looked at her for a long moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled something out. A small, square canvas. It was one of her students' paintings. A chaotic burst of color and joy. I was going to take this with me, he said, to remind me of what matters. Sienna stepped forward, took the canvas, and pressed it back into his chest. Then don't go where you need reminders, she whispered. Stay where the real thing is. He looked down at her, his jaw tense, eyes full. Then slowly, he bent and picked up his bag. But instead of walking toward the gate, he turned and walked toward her. And didn't let go. The snow had melted into slush and the rink had closed for the season. But Vaughn didn't leave. He stayed. Sienna didn't ask how he managed to cancel a London board seat overnight. She didn't want to know the details of what strings he'd pulled. What mattered was that he was still here, and since that moment in the terminal, everything between them had shifted. Not in a fairy tale way. In a real way. Some days were easy. Others were complicated. But every moment felt like something more than what either of them had expected when their lives first collided. Now, 2 months later, they stood together in the back hallway of Oak Ridge Elementary, facing a blank wall that had once been peeling with chipped paint. Sienna held a color palette in one hand and a brush in the other, her hair tied up in a messy knot with streaks of green and gold staining the edge of her sleeve. Are you going to keep staring at the wall or actually help me paint it? She asked, glancing over her shoulder. Vaughn leaned against the opposite wall, arms crossed, wearing a paint-splattered hoodie that had once been white. I'm appreciating the creative process. You're stalling because you're afraid of ruining your perfect brushstrokes. No, I'm stalling because you threatened to throw a sponge at me if I made the clouds look like potatoes again. She smiled, then turned back to the wall, dipping her brush into the paint. The kids are going to love this. They better. I've been studying third-grade art critiques all week. Apparently, I have a lot to live up to. Sienna glanced at him, and her smile softened. You didn't have to do this. I wanted to. He stepped forward finally and joined her at the wall, carefully painting the outline of what looked like a paper airplane drifting through a sky of swirling blues and yellows. The mural had been her idea, a way to celebrate the new art supplies, the renovated classroom, and the kids' sense of imagination. But it had become something more. It had become theirs. As they worked in silence, the rhythmic sound of bristles brushing against plaster filled the corridor. Then, quietly, Vaughn asked, Did your dad ever get to see any of your work? Sienna's hand froze mid-stroke. No. He passed before I graduated. I'm sorry, he said, not trying to fix it, just letting it sit between them. He used to say I saw the world in layers, she said after a moment, that I painted like I was trying to reveal a secret underneath everything. Vaughn stepped closer, eyes on the wall. He was right. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. That night, they walked home together under a sky streaked with the orange glow of streetlights. Her apartment was only 6 blocks from the school, but Vaughn had taken to walking her there every evening, his gloved hand always finding hers by the time they reached the second corner. Outside her building, she paused. I was thinking of applying to a grant program this summer. It's competitive, and I'd have to take a sabbatical, but it's a chance to work with some of the best art educators in the country. He looked at her for a long moment. Then you should do it. I'd be gone for 2 months. I know. I wouldn't be able to see you every day. I didn't fall for you because you were easy to keep close, Sienna. She blinked, caught off guard. I fell for you because you never stop reaching for more. Because you make sure everyone around you believes in something even when you're not sure you do. Her throat tightened. You really mean that? He nodded. I've spent years building things that didn't matter. Now I want to build something that does. With you. She stepped closer, her fingers grazing the edge of his jacket. Then don't let me talk myself out of it. I won't. The next morning, he met her outside the school with 2 coffees and a printed packet of the grant application she'd been too nervous to download. You knew I'd hesitate, she said, scanning the pages. I know you. He handed her a pen. Start writing. The weeks that followed were a blur of early mornings, long days, and late-night editing sessions. Vaughn read every essay draft. He proofed her portfolio. He even helped her set up a makeshift photo studio in her apartment to photograph her students' work. He never once asked for space, never once made her feel guilty for being busy. And when she hit a wall one night and broke down in frustration, he didn't offer advice. He just pulled her close and held her until she could breathe again. Then spring came, bringing with it the results. She got in. The acceptance letter arrived in a thick envelope with a gold seal, and she barely made it up the stairs to her apartment before ripping it open. Vaughn was already waiting inside, having let himself in with the keys she'd given him 2 weeks earlier. He looked up from the couch the second the door opened, saw her face, and stood. I got it, she whispered, breathless. He crossed the room in 2 steps, lifted her off the ground, and spun her once before setting her down. Of course you did. She laughed, then kissed him hard, curling her fingers into his shirt. You believed in me before I did. You made it easy. No, she said, pulling back to look at him. You made it possible. That night, he took her to a rooftop restaurant in Soho, the kind of place with glowing lamps hanging from iron beams and a view of the skyline that looked like a movie set. The maitre d' greeted Vaughn by name, and the table was already set with her favorite wine and a single white lily in a narrow vase. She raised an eyebrow. Did you plan this? He shrugged. I told them I wanted the skyline and the flowers and the wine. They handled the rest. The meal was flawless, every course more delicate than the last. But Sienna hardly tasted any of it. Her focus was on Vaughn, on the way his gaze never left her, on the way his laugh melted into hers, on the way he looked like he belonged in this world but never made her feel like she didn't. After dessert, he reached into his coat pocket and slid a small velvet box across the table. Her breath caught. Vaughn, don't open it yet, he said gently. I want to say something first. She nodded slowly, fingers trembling against the linen napkin in her lap. I've built companies. I've walked away from boardrooms. I've donated millions. But the most important thing I've ever done was sit on that bench at the rink and wait for you to stop walking. She blinked, eyes stinging. You changed everything, Sienna. You didn't just believe in me, you made me want to believe in myself again. You reminded me what it feels like to care about something more than success. He stood from his chair and walked around the table, then knelt beside her and opened the box. Inside was a single ring, vintage rose gold, with a marquise-cut diamond nested between 2 tiny sapphires. I don't want a life that's polished and perfect. I want one with paint on the walls and laughter in the hallways. I want you. Every day. In every way. She covered her mouth, heart pounding. Will you marry me, Sienna Sullivan? Her hands dropped, her eyes locked on his, and she whispered, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and the second he stood, she threw her arms around him and kissed him like she never wanted to stop. The restaurant staff began to applaud softly, but she didn't hear it. All she could hear was the sound of his heart beating against hers and the quiet voice in her head that finally believed this was real. Afterward, they stood on the rooftop balcony, the city stretching out below them. "Do you think the kids will believe it?" she asked, holding up her hand to admire the ring glinting in the warm light. "They're going to scream," he said. "Lily might faint." Sienna laughed, then rested her head against his chest. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For every part of this." He kissed the top of her head. "This is just the beginning." And as they looked out over the city, wrapped in each other's arms, Sienna knew he was right. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of the newly renovated art room at Oak Ridge Elementary, casting soft golden light across the rows of paint jars, brushes, and neatly arranged canvases. Sienna stood barefoot on the step stool, her fingers working to tack the last banner above the drying shelf. Her engagement ring caught the light, casting a prism across the wall, and she paused briefly, heart fluttering at the sight. She hadn't worn it to school until today. Not because she was hiding it everyone already knew, but because she'd wanted to savor the moment. Let it settle into her bones that this wasn't a dream. That the man who used to tie skate laces and joke about mismatched gloves was now hers truly, irrevocably. "Sienna." Principal Harmon's voice echoed from the hallway. "He's here." She climbed down quickly, brushing her hands on her apron just as Vaughn stepped into the room wearing a navy button-down and dark jeans, his hair still damp from a recent shower, a brown paper bag in hand. "Delivery for the best teacher in New York." She narrowed her eyes. "If there's another cinnamon twist in there, I'm going to start thinking you're trying to bribe me into skipping lunch again." He set the bag on her desk and pulled out 2 pastries and a small container of mango slices. "I'm not trying to bribe you. I'm trying to ensure you don't live off vending machine pretzels." Again, she walked over and kissed his cheek. "You're relentless. You say that like it's a bad thing." She leaned back against the desk, eyeing him. "Don't think I didn't notice the way Principal Harmon smiled at you." "What did you do?" "Nothing. Yet." "Vaughn." He held up his hands in mock innocence. "Okay. I might have asked about her budget needs for next year." She exhaled. "You promised you'd let me handle the school side of things." "I did. I just offered to match whatever the district gives her." Quietly, she crossed her arms, but her expression softened. "You're not very good at staying anonymous. I'm not very good at watching you struggle when I can help." Before she could respond, the bell rang and the hallway exploded with footsteps and chatter. Vaughn stepped aside, grabbing his coffee as students began to file in, some waving to him, others whispering excitedly behind cupped hands. "Is he your fiancé?" one of the 4th graders asked, pointing directly at Vaughn. Sienna resisted the urge to laugh. "Yes. And he's very shy about it, so don't make a big deal." The girl turned to Vaughn. "Are you going to be at the art show tonight?" He nodded. "Wouldn't miss it." Sienna gave him a look as he slipped out, mouthing "behave" just before the door clicked shut behind him. Hours passed in a blur of paint, glitter explosions, and last-minute framing. When evening fell, the halls of Oak Ridge transformed. The gymnasium was lit with soft string lights and filled with easels showcasing the students' best work. Parents drifted between displays, sipping apple cider and snapping photos. Sienna stood near the center, directing volunteers and adjusting crooked name cards. She wore a soft plum-colored blouse tucked into black slacks, her hair pinned back with a clip carved like a feather. One of Vaughn's quieter gifts slipped into her bag a week after their engagement. "Miss Sullivan," a voice called from behind her. She turned to see Lily's mom approaching, her daughter in tow. "I just wanted to say thank you." Lily's never been this excited about anything. Lily beamed and held up a small canvas of a swirling blue tree against a silver sky. "I want to be a muralist when I grow up." Sienna bent to examine it. "You already are." The moment was interrupted by a wave of murmurs near the entrance. She followed the sound and froze. Vaughn had arrived, but not alone. A tall woman in a navy suit walked beside him, followed by a man holding a camera. They weren't paparazzi. They were dressed too cleanly, too purposefully. "What is that?" she asked as he reached her. I should have told you earlier, he said, eyes apologetic. They're from the Whitmore Initiative. I didn't want a media moment, but they insisted on capturing the first full program launch. They're donating to 10 schools next fall. This is the pilot. You used Oak Ridge as the launch? I used you as the blueprint. She stared at him, her voice caught in her throat. I told them I didn't want a press release. No headlines. Just proof that doing this right works. That investing in kids doesn't need to be flashy, it needs to be real. Sustainable. You made that happen. She looked past him at the students dragging their parents toward their displays, at the glitter still clinging to the gym floor, at the pride on faces that rarely saw themselves celebrated. I don't know what to say. You already said yes to something bigger than this. This is just the ripple. The cameraman approached gently. Mind if we get a few shots of the two of you with the exhibit? Sienna hesitated. Vaughn caught her hand. You don't have to do anything you're not comfortable with. She looked up at him. Actually, I think I want them to see what this looks like. They posed by the mural board where the students' self-portraits surrounded a quote painted in bold strokes, "Art is the way we whisper our dreams out loud." As the camera clicked, Sienna slid her hand around Vaughn's waist and whispered, "You know you're going to be totally mobbed by kids after this." "I'm prepared. I brought extra stickers." The rest of the night unfolded like a symphony. Parents thanked her. Students tugged at Vaughn's sleeves to tell him about their projects. Principal Harmon gave a short speech thanking the anonymous donor, never naming Vaughn, but glancing at him knowingly. When the gym finally emptied and the volunteers began folding chairs, Sienna and Vaughn stepped outside into the cool night. The sidewalk was quiet now, the glow from the building casting long shadows on the pavement. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded sheet of paper. "What's that?" "Your grant itinerary." She raised a brow. "You hacked my email?" "No," he said, smiling. "You left it open on your laptop. I just added something." She unfolded the paper. A single red line was drawn under the words "Final Week, New York City Showcase." "You're coming." "I'm not missing your first national exhibit, Sienna. I'll be in the front row." She looked at him, heartful. "You're really all in." "I was all in the second you made a joke about my gloves." She laughed, then stepped forward and slipped her arms around his neck. "You changed my life. You changed mine first." They stood there like that in the quiet hum of a city that never stopped moving, but somehow paused just long enough for them to catch their breath. Later that night, back at her apartment, Sienna pulled a worn sketchbook from her shelf, the one she hadn't opened in years. The one she used to carry before bills and exhaustion made her forget what it felt like to draw for herself. She sat on the couch, legs tucked beneath her, Vaughn's head resting against her thigh as he read through a proposal draft on his tablet. "What are you working on?" he asked without looking up. She flipped the page and began sketching the outline of a man on a skating rink, surrounded by children, laughter curling like smoke from their mouths. "I'm drawing you." He looked up then, eyes soft. "Why?" She smiled. "Because I want to remember how it all began." He reached up and laced his fingers through hers. "You won't forget." "No," she said quietly, pressing a kiss to his temple. "I won't." The ring on her finger gleamed faintly in the lamplight as she drew the curve of his shoulders, the tilt of his head, the ease in his stance that had fooled her into thinking he was just another guy on the ice. But he wasn't. He was hers. And this was their beginning. A light breeze rustled the budding trees in Central Park as Sienna leaned against the railing of Bow Bridge, watching the rowboats drift lazily through the water below. The spring air was warm against her skin, laced with that early April promise of something new. She tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear and glanced to her left where Vaughn stood, arms folded, his gaze fixed on the lake like he was trying to memorize the way the sun hit the surface. "I can't believe you convinced me to take the afternoon off," she said, nudging his elbow. "You've been living on caffeine and adrenaline for 2 weeks. Letting you breathe isn't exactly criminal. You bribed my substitute with Knicks tickets." "I negotiated," he said, glancing down at her with a grin. "Semantics." She laughed, shaking her head. "And the park. You said you wanted to sketch water in motion." "I remembered." She lifted an eyebrow. "I said that once in passing. I listened to everything you say, Sienna. The quiet that settled between them wasn't empty. It was full of the kind of comfort that only came when two people had stopped wondering if they belonged to each other. They just did. Down by the water, a child squealed with delight as a duck paddled past her boat. A couple nearby leaned into each other, whispering over a shared coffee. Everything around them felt suspended in that rare kind of stillness New York almost never allowed. Sienna pulled her sketchbook from her bag and flipped past pages of abstract blurs and student portraits until she found a blank sheet. She sat cross-legged on the nearest bench and began to draw, pencil gliding without hesitation. "What is it this time?" Vaughn asked, crouching beside her. "You're back," she said absently, shading in the slope of his shoulder. "The way you stand when you're thinking about something you aren't ready to say." He was quiet for a beat. Then, "I've been looking at properties." She paused mid-sketch. "Properties. A building, actually, in the West Village. It used to be an art gallery. Closed during the pandemic. Still zoned for community use." She set the sketchbook on her lap. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I want to open it again. As a permanent community art space. Free classes. Rotating exhibits. Outreach initiatives. For the city? For the kids. For you." Her breath caught in her throat. "You've done more with worn brushes and broken easels than most people do with full funding and glossy grants. I want to give you a place where none of those limits exist." She blinked, overwhelmed. "Vaughn, that's huge." "I know. That's why I didn't bring it up before. I didn't want you to think it was some grand gesture to make up for something. It's not. It's a foundation. For everything else we're building." She stared at him, heart-thudding. "You already bought it, didn't you?" "I made an offer." "Of course you did." He grinned. "You'll have full creative control. I'm just the guy who fixes the roof and stocks the snack bar." She leaned forward and kissed him quickly. "No one has ever believed in me like you do." "I'm not believing in you. I'm betting on you." Later that evening, after the sun dipped behind the buildings and the air cooled, they walked hand in hand through the cobblestone streets of the village toward the old gallery. It sat nestled between a bookstore and a cafe, its windows dusty but intact, its brick facade faded but strong. Sienna stepped inside and exhaled slowly. The open space stretched wide before her, skylights bathing the hardwood floors in soft silver light. She turned in a slow circle, imagining easels lined along the far wall, students seated at long tables, laughter echoing against the high ceilings. "It's perfect," she whispered. "You haven't even seen the upstairs loft." She turned. "There's an upstairs?" He nodded. "It was the original owner's studio. Still has the old beams and a skylight. Thought you might like a space to work that isn't your kitchen table." She walked over and wrapped her arms around his waist. "You think of everything. I think of you." Over the next few weeks, the gallery transformed. Vaughn hired a local contractor, but Sienna made all the creative calls. She picked the paint, chose the lighting, coordinated with neighborhood schools, and created a rotating calendar of classes and exhibits. Children's art, teen photography, adult sculpture nights, it was all there. The night before the opening, she stood in the center of the finished space, barefoot on the polished floors, staring up at the freshly hung sign above the entrance, the Sullivan Collective. Vaughn came up behind her, arms circling her waist. "You didn't fight me on the name." "I thought about it," she said. "But then I realized you were right. This is mine. Yours, ours, theirs. It's all the same." She leaned back against him. "It feels like a beginning." "It is." The ribbon cutting was modest but emotional. Teachers, parents, and students gathered in the afternoon sunlight, cheering as Sienna and Vaughn cut the ribbon together. Cameras flashed, not from media outlets, but from proud families and teary-eyed volunteers. Inside, the first exhibit featured collaborative student pieces, murals, storyboards, clay sculptures. A hand-painted quote stretched across the back wall in looping script, "Create boldly. Dream without apology." Sienna stood by the entrance, greeting guests, answering questions, watching children dart between displays with wide eyes. Vaughn watched her from across the room, arms folded, a contented smile tugging at his lips. She caught his eye and crossed the room. You look like you're trying not to cry, she teased. I'm fine. Just something in the air. Dust? Pride. She tilted her head. You're allowed to be proud. I am. Of you. Of this. Of us. They stepped outside for air just as dusk settled over the city. The street was quiet now, the last few guests lingering inside. Sienna leaned against the brick wall, arms wrapped around herself. You're thinking about the summer, Vaughn said. I leave in 3 weeks. He nodded. I know. You'll come to the showcase? I already booked the flight. She looked up at him. You'll be okay while I'm gone? Don't worry about me. I'll be surrounded by paint fumes and 10-year-olds who think glitter is a personality trait. She laughed. Promise you won't turn the gallery into a tech company while I'm away? I promise. No algorithms. Just acrylics. The day she left for the grant program was warm and bright. Vaughn drove her to the airport in his black SUV, music low, their hands intertwined on the center console. At the terminal, she turned to him, suddenly unsure. What if I miss you too much? Then you'll come home with a portfolio full of brilliance and a heart too full to keep it all inside. She kissed him, long and slow, and whispered, I love you. He cupped her face in his hands. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anything. The summer passed in a blur of workshops, lectures, and late-night painting sessions. Sienna thrived, her work evolving in ways she hadn't anticipated. Every few days, Vaughn sent her a photo, a new display going up, a child holding a painting, a mural being added to the side alley. He didn't call often, but when he did, it was never rushed. Just steady. Sure. When she returned, the gallery held a welcome-back celebration. Vaughn had organized it without telling her. The space was filled with new pieces, fresh faces, and a long table covered in dishes from her favorite takeout spots. He pulled her aside, away from the noise and the laughter. I have something for you. She raised a brow. Another building? Not this time. He handed her a wrapped canvas. She opened it slowly, revealing a painting in his hand, not hers. It was imperfect. The brushwork was rough. But the image was unmistakable, her, sitting in the gallery window, sketchbook in lap, light spilling over her shoulder. You painted this? I tried. She touched the edge of the canvas, heart swelling. It's beautiful. It's you, he said. Exactly how I see you. She kissed him then, right there in the middle of the gallery, surrounded by color and sound and the hum of a life they'd built together. And for the first time in forever, she felt settled. Not because things were perfect, but because they were real, rooted, full of promise. And she knew without question that she was exactly where she was meant to be. With him. Always.